Said peace, peace, peace. So I sit there and let YouTube do what it do to contact some people to hop on this, to hop on this live, this episode. And so just let me know if you're able to hear me so I can make sure that everything is functional. In the meanwhile, as this YouTube is kind of contacting, send out the notifications, feel free to interact. Um, those of you, if that's on here, you see anyone kind of trolling and stuff like that, definitely eliminate their comments. That's not necessary for what we're trying to do. But let me know what city you're from, and feel free to express ideas and thoughts you have in reference to this. If I don't address it immediately while I'm doing the presentation, I definitely will at the end will look at it and try to draw attention to that. So definitely, please, you're invited to interact. That kind of gives it a good vibe, good energy, anyways. But what we're going to do is touch back down on Kandi Buress and Todd Tucker's relationship, and we're going to focus from the relationship numerology angle. And so we already did episode 1, and this is episode 2. And so what we're going to do is, in episode 1, we brought some things out. And so today, I want to do is really tap into what caused their relationship um, to drift. Okay. I use a phrase in the first episode where we said, their relationship experienced a conflict fade, not really a conflict fight. And I think a lot of us are used to conflict fights and not a conflict fade. And a lot of times, we know a conflict fade probably happened because where randomly we hear people are splitting up, people are like, well, whoa, how are they splitting up? It's pretty much a good indication that they have more of a conflict fade in their dynamic, okay, or in their personal challenges that they're dealing with or trying to work past or just move away from. Okay, and so when we look at the numerology from Candace's individual numbers and then Todd's individual numbers, it just highly indicates that their current challenge that they're moving past in a relationship, let's realize that they have more of a conflict fade. And so I want to just bring out some key lessons from the numerology, looking at the energetics associated with their relationship and see what we kind of can draw, an understanding from. So again, as you know, this is not a critique about them or anything like that. I know they're public figures. I know they're on, reality TV. I don't watch the shows or anything like that. So I don't have additional opinions into it. I'm just very familiar with Kandi Buress in terms of I always admired her inside the group Escape, and I always admired her business prowess and just things I saw associated around that. Okay, so with that in mind, we're going to get into this. And so the soul numbers, the individual soul numbers with Kandi is 5859. Todd is 8425 for those who understands the numerology numbers assignment in reference to representing a soul profile. And so last episode we broke down with you when their numbers come together, uh, when our relationships come together, period, there it generates an energy field, right? When you and I come together, it brings about an energy field. The thing is, what is it? What's the nature of it? And what do I need to do align with to amplify that energy? And then what do I need to make sure that I don't amplify with it in order to experience the shadow part of it? And so what we see in their dynamic right here is when Todd and Candace comes together, they generate an androgynous neutral type of energy that oversees the overall nature of their relationship. Okay, and so typically That means they're very adaptable. There's great qualities with it. But then the next thing, when we start to just dig a little bit deeper, we start to dive into um, peace. We start to dive in a little deeper. And so then we start to look at the energetics of it. Okay, so we know their relationship, androgynous energy, right? Androgynous neutral. Okay, so then we start to look at whether their relationship dealing with them individually inside the relationship, what's the likelihood for them to pull or generate the shadow from each other, and then also the shadow from the overarching energy in the relationship. And so when we begin to look at that, um, they actually score a 53. And so the 53, uh, the 53 indicates that they have an active shadow field. Okay. So looking at their numbers, looking at what it generates together energetically, one of the metrics that I'm pulling from is looking at their active shadow field. They have you're looking at what's the likelihood for them to pull and operate from the shadows? They're showing a 53. And that 53 indicates an active shadow field. So this means inside the relationship, in their dealings, there's a lot of shadow tendencies peppered inside their relationship operations. So even though, say, for example, with all the good and all the positive attributes and emanations that we might witness and see, or even recognize from their soul alignments, together we're recognizing that they have a strong likelihood to pepper in a lot of their shadows together. Okay, so we look at that. Now I want to look at them separately as individuals and look at what's their likelihood to pull from the shadow. And so what we're going to do is I'm looking at Kandi and Todd's individual soul numbers. Okay. And what we're doing is we're looking at what is basically the ratio between their internal peace versus their internal war. And basically what that is highlighting is how much internal resistance they have operating inside them, inside their soul persona. Okay. And so when we look at that from the individual aspect, and then we put that together, between them both, there's definitely a strong shadow pool that shows at 57. So they score 57. So from an individual basis, you know, so we got the collective, then we look at it from the individual basis. From the collective, they score like a 53, showing the active shadow field. And then we see, well, the participant, what's the participation in it from both of them? And it's showing 57. So what this means is that both of them are highly liable to be pulling from their shadows in terms of what they project inside to the relationship in different areas. So we look at it. So what areas would these probably come from? Well, one of the interesting things that when we look at the numbers closely and deeply, and there's a thing that we call resonance, right? Resonance is what determining if what's going to hold, basically what's going to stick. I'm attracted to you, that's one thing, but it's one thing if I'm at home with you or if I stick with you. And so when we look at some things right here, look at the numbers, some things that jumps out, um, looking at the resonances, and there's 9 different resonances. Okay. Um, we see there's a lot of things swirling around their social resonance and image resonance. And so what that points to is let us realize that even though they came together, even though they're kind of very public, underneath it all, um, they don't share the same picture of themselves or collectively in what they represent outwardly to the world and to the social mix of things. The underlying shared values are not congruent. Their cultural projection is not congruent. So when I talk about cultural projections, when two or more people come together to create a culture, what is this expression, right? So we're not talking about like black culture, white culture, and stuff like that. We're talking about the culture that you create. What are the customs and the things, what's the flair, what's the dynamic, what's that aura that when y'all come together, does it match your picture? It doesn't. Sometimes, for example, we got somebody that's very overly flamboyant and they want all this attention upon them, and another person is not very flamboyant, they don't care about the attention. So that creates a what? A cultural clash inside the relationship. And that's also a link into one of the five intimacies, cultural intimacy. And so we see right here in terms of Kandi and Todd that there's a high likelihood that they wrestle with cultural intimacy. Okay, because when you look at it in terms of lifestyle, so even though they have high visibility, a lot of different things underneath it all, one of the probably driving causes behind their drift, behind the quiet fade over time, was because they really don't share the same picture about what they are together, what they are to each other, and what they are to the social mix of things. Okay. And so let me know if this makes sense for y'all, as I'm kind of going into this, as I'm building this. And so that's very important, very big. And as y'all heard me in the last episode, and probably heard me mention it many different times, or definitely on Patreon, you hear me speak about the mirroring factor. And we have something we call the relationship pentagon. And one of the angles of the relationship pentagon is the mirroring factor, and then also the individuality. So when I see that there is some question and some attention circling, a lot of tension, let me put it like this, excuse me, a lot of tension circling around their image resonance. In other words, this is the part that makes you stick. So if they're not sticking, this is coming from right here, is that we're seeing that the underlining factors are just not in alignment. And our values hold a lot of weight in the longevity and the endurance of our relationship. So when I look at these things that is kind of really off, it's like, ooh, there's a problem there. Okay. And so it also shows in their relationship dynamic. One thing I mentioned in their last episode is we talk about the battery, they social sexual battery is extremely high. So that's a good thing. They have enough, when we say there's enough polarity to keep the spark going. The thing in their case is, in their case is they got a lot of it. So the thing is like, how does it get channeled? How do we channel this high battery? And y'all remember last episode, you can check the last episode, I kind of said, I think that also kind of contribute to some things because they did not put proper containers or type of, boundaries to direct the energy. So let's get back to the androgynous piece I'm talking about. One of the downside with the androgynous energy just flows in the path of least resistance. The androgynous energy is dominant in their relationship. So inside their, their setup, they do have masculine energy, but it's just not dominant. So the relationship typically is not going to provide a lot of direction. And then the other part is neutral. So they can function in a passive state because they're in a very allowing type of mentality. Okay. And so that begins to affect the dynamics, especially when you start to apply time to it. Okay. So you don't want to have this going on and you don't have anything to kind of amplify or instigate to move in a certain direction that needs to be, especially when you have a high social sexual battery. Okay. And so sometimes you got too much freedom. That freedom begins to work against you. So we know that's probably another issue that probably caused, their thing. So one of the things I talked about is the conflict fade cycle instead of the conflict fights. And in their case, based off their numbers, because it's androgynous, because it's neutral, because they have a lot of strong air, and the air actually shifts over into some shadow stuff, we see that they're more liable to have a conflict fade going on. And conflict fade simply refers to a quiet breakdown. So it shows that this relationship, if it's not looking at its strengths and not stimulating certain things, it's very high likely to go into a slow roll, quiet breakdown. And I think that's kind of what was witnessed. You know, they've been married for 11 years, but there might have been, there's probably a lot of subtle things that just wasn't addressed. And that's some of the other contributions to a conflict phase cycle. So, when we look at the energetics and we talk about a conflict phase cycle, typically relationships, I'm talking about combined together, that have high neutral scores, they're very prone to witness or experience a conflict phase cycle. Relationships with low dominant positions is likely to contribute or to generate a conflict phase cycle. Relationships with intensified air, a lot of air energy, will instigate a conflict phase cycle. Relationships with strong earth, all right, with a strong earthwood presence, is liable to instigate a strong conflict phase cycle. And then also when it has low feminine energy, it's liable to instigate a conflict phase cycle. And so in looking at Kandi and Todd's relationship, all across the board, their scores matches this. So so in other words, their relationship is not going to quote unquote have a big uproar and all this other stuff. It's their issue is more being faded out over a period of time. It wasn't a breakup, it was a stagnation or a breakdown that occurred. So going back to what I was saying about the shadow pools, because despite them having a high battery, but they also had a strong score showing shadow pools. So think about it. I got this strong shadow pool going on, but I got this lot of extra energy, a lot of freedom. You think of how that might mix, right? And so if together they come with an active shadow field of a 53, and then when you look at them individually and look at what they liable to project into, the shadow aspect, and they're coming at a 47, at a 57, then we have to really start to venture and look at the shadow dynamics of the androgynous piece, of the neutral piece, and with themselves individually. And so when we look at the shadow aspect, a lot of their shadow comes through the emotional gate. Okay. The emotional gate and their sensory gate. That's where they are highly susceptible to receiving or to generate a lot of shadows. In other words, from the sensory gate, you probably take a lot of the freedom you have and going for sensations, right? Or creating a situation of sensations to build a connection or a togetherness. But at all same time it brings in, opens door for tension. And just kind of some random things I kind of saw. I was like, ooh, that kind of makes sense when you look at it. Then emotionally, even though they have air, they're not speaking to the relationship. They speak to the problem. So this is what I'm going to get at. And so those of you in the Patreon, y'all know I did an audio drop talking about going more into when I talk about conflicts and how sometimes our conflict is more mental than relational. And Kandi and Todd's scenario is highly likely to have that going on, like a lot of us probably has. And so when we start to talk about what do you mean, the conflict is more mental than relational? Well, sometimes we are avoiding the emotional or the vulnerability piece inside relationships. When we're more mental, we're more trying to define the problem, or we're trying to solve the information that's associated with the conflict. Where if you're more relational focused, you're more focused on the bond, the resonance piece. Okay. And so what begins to happen, especially when you have a lot of air in which they do. Um, you have a lot of earthwood too. You tend to shift to focus on what's more practical, not dismissing the need for practicality. Sometimes we lead and we jump there first, and we forget that we're in a relationship. We're not in a task. I want y'all to hear me. We're in a relationship. We're not inside a task. And a lot of people that are more intellectual or intellectualize their emotions, they're not realizing that what happens is we're really looking at a relationship from a task point of view and not really a relational point of view. So when a conflict comes, which is just a signal that we need to visit what is keeping us glued together or what might be weakening the glue. Um, when we got this going on, it becomes very challenging when we're not focusing on the relational part and we're focusing on the informational part. Because what happens is this: you'd be like, okay, yeah, we addressed it, we got it, and you move on. You wonder why. Well, how come the problem still keeps reoccurring? Because you never got back to reestablishing or reassuring the bond. So I think when you talk about Kandi and Todd's, there was a lot of overlooking, a lot of bypassing, and they start to create a lot of emotional residue. Remember, I said there are emotional gateways and tension. And so, even though they have a lot of air, they never really are addressing the issue. The real issue is the relational piece, not the intellectual piece, not the informational piece, but the bond factor. What is going on that's hindering our bond? And let's address what's hindering our bond so that we can refresh, reconnect, restore, and reset at the relational part. And then when we do that, then we can kind of look at, okay, what's some of the mental things that we need clarity on. But a lot of times is we ignore the relational piece, even though we're addressing things going on inside the relationship. Okay. Um, yep. Okay. So that's kind of what's going on inside our dynamic. So picture this, and this is continual. It's ongoing. Okay. And so when you have these, keep in mind, and they both have a high degree of active shadow field. And when we talk about the shadow field, the active shadow field of 53, what that points out to is this, simply put, is that it has a lot of unresolved patterns that surfaces regularly. That's what it means. And so what it tells us is that this relationship dynamic is very prone to create uh, these contra um, or these oppositional patterns, but never really address it while it's small, but continues to let it grow because you continue to bypass it, and then it becomes in a shadow form. Because what's happened is that their mix, when they come together, they have a strong chance, over 50% chance. Now, is that apply to all relationships? Some relationships don't have a high shadow tendency. Okay, so it just depends on people's soul numbers and their connection. So it's not a blanket view. But in their case, when you really look at it, they're from the individual projection, they're at 57, so that's close to 60%. So what they realize is that they're more prone to generate a lot of resistance. In their relationship dynamic, they're moving through a lot more resistance, whether it's small or big. So if they're not really addressing these things and it's sitting there accumulating and just bypassing, which is easy to do, especially if you have an androgynous oriented relationship, it's just sitting there festering. And then it's easy to make you lose sight of the matters at hand, right? Because you now have you have unresolved patterns that keep surfacing regularly. And it's because you don't want to address it directly. You keep creating ways, activities, sensory. Remember I said they also have conflict through their sensory gate, the tension there. So now I got to create excitement, or I got to create fun or distractions to make sure that we don't, make us feel the senses, right? to make us feel the sensation that, we're still good, we Gucci, when you really are not, because you still got these unresolved patterns that's continuing to stack up and it's just accumulating. Okay. And so, and keep in mind, there's not enough time and space in the engagements from the conflicts for you to resolve them. They become short, they become closer and closer together. So, for example, you might have one conflict, you got enough distance in there where you can let the conflict die out, let it completely, everyone can resolve from it, restore from it, reset from it, and don't have to worry about it again. But when it's closer, and you got this conflict here and here, and there's not that much space in between the conflicts, and you bypass it, you're just stacking and stacking and stacking and stacking it until it becomes something very visible and very clear, and now you got to address it, but it's already built momentum. So now you got these dual momentums going on inside your relationship operation. And so now a lot of times people succumb to the counter force. You got a force you think you got, moving together with, but then you create this counter force on the side, and now it's just coming in and being your Achilles heel. Okay, and so what begins to happen is this. Keep in mind, I want y'all to keep in mind, this all is cyclical. So when you bypass it, what you avoid, you grow. What you avoid, you continue. And so they also show a lot of avoidance. And so they also show avoidance in the aspect of, and this is deep, this is heavy. They show avoidance at the correspondence level. In other words, they show a direct avoidance at the mirroring level. So they have to they have to really make sure they see that we're in alignment with what we are to each other, what we're putting out. Well, they have an avoidance there. So there's a likelihood they're not even addressing what is our picture together. What are we to each other? And keep in mind, there's a low dominant score, and other aspect is androgynous, and they got a strong neutral. And their neutral is more functioning. Their air name neutral is more functioning in the shadow aspect, which means when we talk about the shadow aspect of the air and the neutral position, they both share something in common: avoidance. So that's how when we look at the numbers, look at for numerology, we see that there's a lot of avoidance that's also peppered inside their relationship. Okay, which you hear me use the phrase bypassing. This is why it's there. Okay, and so you start to see this quiet accumulation. And remember, I said they already have tension, emotion, and gateway. So they're just kind of, just moving by, and they have a natural tendency like, oh, we good and stuff like that. We're filling with activity and stuff, and they just snowball in this effect. Okay. And so what happens is when conflicts come up, they think about it, they talk about it, but they never drive it home. They never apply it to the relationship, even though they think they are. Okay. The ultimate part, what happens is they create emotional distancing. And so every time they have a conflict, so think about it, the conflicts are in shorter spans, and they keep bypassing, that equals to them doing more emotional distancing. The problem is everyone's connected to the emotions. Everybody's connected to the emotions. And so as it continues to distance, y'all are moving more further away now. Because you're avoiding, right? And also because, I talked about earlier, your image and your social resonance are not congruent. And those hold a lot of weight because we're talking about the endurance, the long, the underlining values. Both of those both of those resonances points directly to the underlining core foundations, the core of you. And so when the core of you is not matching alignment with a particular partner, it's going to create a lot of rifts over time. A lot of times in these situations, you don't see it immediately because it's silent. It's like a seed. Core values is equivalent to a seed. And so it takes time for the seed to break ground and to begin to start to grow. And so that's their case. This is why they're more liable to have a drifting. They won't see the problem until later on. Okay? Because at the core value level, they probably didn't really make sure to be mindful or to protect the very thing that drew y'all together at the core level, and to make sure you build a wall of protection around it and make sure you continue to stimulate that. But because they have so much freedom, because they have a strong battery, they were inviting a lot of stuff into the relationship. And then it's hard to pinpoint, what's relevant, what's not relevant, and so forth. And then if you got a lot of opinions coming into the mix, right? And all this stuff going on now, and that comes from they have metal, but their metal is kind of one of their weaker elements. So that means they probably wrestle with what? Boundaries. So picture, wrestle with boundaries, and you have a lot of air, a lot of freedom. Just use your imagination of what can occur from that. That's based off their numbers right there. Okay. And so when we start to dig more into that, we start to see certain patterns. We see a pattern of silencing. Silencing what? Silencing my feelings, silencing our communication. We're speaking, but we're not speaking from the heart, what the heart matters. We're losing sight of the bond factor. And this easily can happen to any of us in a relationship. At the base of a relationship is the heart. You could be talking all day long, coming to all these different things. And the end of the day is, are we at home with each other? And when you lose sight of what's keeping you at home with each other, then the other things is easy to derail you. When the wind blows left, you're going left. When the wind blows right, you're going right. Because you don't have an anchor, you don't have a root. And so you have to root inside each other's hearts. So when the conflicts come, we have to be mindful to shift to roots into the heart. We have to make sure we get to the bonding factor. So you have to visit the emotions. You can't dismiss the emotion. And that's hard, especially for how some of us are wired. But we have to we have to visit that. We got to figure out ways how to refresh the base of the individual, the base of us together, and also refresh each other's ego, sense of importance. Because if you don't do that, then what happens is it shifts the value placement upon each other and upon your relationship. You invite more room for doubting your value, which then that's another nasty cycle that comes in, because now that becomes ego driven. And when you go on the path of that, there is no vulnerability in that path when you start getting ego driven. There is no a consideration. Why? Because that path lacks the earthwood and the water. And those two elements at least brings you some consideration of each other. The air helps you bring considerations, but if you shift in your value, now the air part of the ego gets distorted. It's going to favor more of its shadows. It's going to become what? Self-seeking. So there's a part inside Kandi and Todd's relationship that we've probably seen, because I don't watch the episodes and stuff, but I guarantee if you go back and look at it now doing this, you'll probably see it, that you see a lot of self-seeking going on. There's probably a lot of conflicts of self-seeking generated. In other words, you start to see the ego just take its flare, and it's out of pocket now, because there's a part of the relationship that wasn't visiting the water quality that it needs. The thing about their relationship, for clarity, they have good representation of water in their dynamic, actually. But so this is a beautiful thing when we look at it. When we look at the relationship, we do diagnostics and start looking at. We look at these relationships scores from different angles, because it's not always linear. If you look at it in the forefront, you're like, oh, they got good water, so they got good bonding. Yes, but then we look at it, so well, hold up. Let's look at their individual pull towards the shadow and look at the collective pull towards the shadow, and that number looks different. Even though they got like strong sexual social battery, but we look at it as, ooh, that's a lot. Where can it get placed in? Does it have enough container? Well, we start to look at it. What's the number one part that can kind of give a proper container? Is the metal. Well, the metal is not really strong where it needs to be. So there's a liableness that the container is not going to be where it needs to be to hold all that freedom and all that individuality that they need in that space that they need, because they have a strong air they do need space inside their relationship. So if they're in a confine where they're trying to cramp each other's space for the sake of whatever it might be, that now becomes a conflict and not even realizing it. Some of us function better when we have a degree of space inside in our dealings. Some of us work very better when we have excessive closeness. But unfortunately, a lot of times when we get caught up in the paradigm that our conditioning lays out, a lot of us will measure relationships like how often we're close to each other. And that might not be your dynamic individually or your dynamic when you partner with somebody. Some people you might partner with, it generates this, oh, we just want a lot of closeness. There's some people you might partner with, it's like we need more distancing to make it work. And this is the advantage when you start to understand our energetics behind ourselves, energetics behind our relationship structures, to see like what's that flow? What's that flow like? And you look at their flow. Now the thing about it is Candace and Todd can have that aspect of extended closeness, but there's also still a part where they need extended space. And so but then when you look at their shadow, because their shadow scores is really high, we see that it can get confused. And so we know also with androgynous energy, if you're pulling that into the shadow, androgynous energy can lose its identity. It can get confused. Because, now the good thing about androgynous energy, it focuses on peace and balance, truth of things. But if it's in the shadow, oh my God, now it's about untruth, imbalance, and what? Chaos or confusion. It shifts just that fast. And this is why we look at their shadow pool. So what we're saying right now is that their relationship dynamic, that they had all the good ingredients energetically, but when we start to pepper in and look at the shadow factors, they energize the shadow parts of their relationship. Okay. And then over a period of time, how it has its own identity. And so sometimes we don't want to face the shadow identity that we created together. So that's where the blame shifting comes into play. Another piece of the shadow air, another piece of the shadow neutral. And so all of a sudden now, so they see the easiest resolution is what? To disband or to divorce, But the thing is, in that people choose that, that's fine, but you still have unspoken irritations that you might not have really needed to address that you probably needed to. Okay. And then that's going to roll over to other dynamics. So what begins to happen in their case, and as we kind of tie this down, the process of conflict fading, it kind of occurred in these steps. One, it got into a space of discomfort. So as they got into discomfort, they had these unspoken things they never really spoke about. You know how it is in a relationship. He's like, I can't stand that about them. But you never, it's all mental. You never really speak to it addressed in the relationship. So there's a discomfort that was growing. There was an aspect of emotional fatigue that came in. Think about it. All that air going on, all that overthinking, it created fatigue, emotional fatigue that kicked in. Them trying to be polite around each other's issues. In other words, we're going to bypass it, but not really address it. That became very strong. So then that creates a withdrawal. And so you already know, think about it. When we start withdrawing in a relationship, what are we doing? We're withdrawing our energy, which then you increase the chances for what? Creating what? Stagnation. You're stagnating the energy because we're no longer energizing the bond factors that we need to keep us together. And so what happens is when that kicks in, it creates what? The drift. And so this is why the causes behind Kandi and Todd's relationship, this is what caused their drift. All these things kind of playing, at hand. Okay. And so like, well, what can you do they can reconcile and fix. I think I said in the last episode that don't be shocked if later, sometimes you need space to see the truth in things. And they might come to some certain resolutions inside themselves with the space. And I was I was being serious, but I was jokingly saying it. But sometimes we need legal space. Sometimes some of our relationships will function better without a legal tag to it. And so sometimes, and I come across in this year's been interesting. I come across a lot of mature, you know, older couples where they've been together. I used an example on the last episode, but I met a couple people like that where they were married at one time legally, but then years later they said they circled back around and found a level of intimacy that they didn't recognize before when they were married or when they was a little bit younger. And so that typically happens. What I'm saying is sometimes we have things in the way. The legality. Well, what's how legality in the way? Well, that sense of obligation, the sense of knowing back of my mind I could penalize you for not complying with an unexpected agreement or a verbalized agreement or whatever it might be. And so it's like you almost, y'all have this leverage thing on each other. If you do wrong, I can threaten this to happen to create a consequence, right? And sometimes you put a lot of time in, that actually gets in the way of the consciousness of the relationship. Where if you didn't have it, you're more focused on the heart of each other more often. Some people don't have the ability to separate, to be in a legal obligation, but maintain a side of heart. So I'm not saying dismiss the legal. What I'm saying is, the question is, can you have the legal and still maintain a sense of heart? Because that's what you're connected to. You're not connected to the contract, or then you might be in a lot of cases. And so what happens is, I'm saying is that because they have a lot of androgynous energy with their chemistry, reconciliation it aligns very strongly with the androgynous neutral. Forgiveness aligns very strong with that. Now, because individually they do generate a lot of shadows, it might not happen, but it can. It's in the energy field to occur, because there is an aspect of, they start reflecting, and they have children that co-parent, they might not become an item, but they might reconfigure. That's nothing too. We were supposed to be like this to each other. We were supposed to be like this with each other. And they might discover that and function in that, whatever that might be. So you can curate your relationship dynamic around the soul alignments that y'all share together, around the resonances that you share with each other. So sometimes you need a break, a breaking up, a destruction of a thing, in order to find out what is the true thing that we should be revolving around with each other. Okay. So I think there's some opportunities in their dynamic that's possibly there, if they're open to get the lessons and see things from a different reflection. But the shadow is high, so you know how that can be. But it depends on that. It is determined by them. But when you look at this overall, the thing is, realize sometimes when we come together in relationships, the thing is, like, just because we score high in the shadow, does it mean that it's doomed? No. What it means is that y'all need to have more awareness about y'all's combination of what it can generate if you're not, first of all, self-governing yourselves in a certain way. Because if you're not, then you're liable to allow certain things to pepper itself in there and start to weave itself in there, and then y'all start responding to that thing, and next it just got y'all drifting in a whole different direction. Okay. And so this is why we need the vulnerability. We talk about vulnerability, about being able to express, but one of the big favorable things for vulnerability is to begin to have this visibility of each other, so that way we can keep things maintained and sustained, but at the same time as keep us very flexible with each other. If we don't have the vulnerability, you can't get that. Then people start trying to mimic it by giving false freedoms. And I think that happened in their relationship. They gave each other false freedoms and calling it intimacy or vulnerability, when it wasn't. It was just avoidance. Okay. And so before I hop off of here, let me look and see what we have. So if there is fading, yet they love each other, how can they make it spicy again? Oh, great question. I think in their case, I don't think they lost the spice. um, I think they had a lot of spice. I think the spice is kind of what worked against them. Um, but I get what you're saying, and your question is the main thing that they avoided was vulnerability. So I think it's not them really trying to find their spice, it's trying to find their connection. The spice is easy for them. They got a high battery. They can turn it up. But when we start looking through different things, we start to see an underlying theme is, are you really emotionally connected? Do y'all sense the same thing with each other? You know how you with someone and you're really connected, you can sense things for them. There's a level of intuition that develops with your partner or your lover. I don't think they have that. And so I think the gateway to that is to get vulnerable with each other. I think that's where the ice, uh, yes. Oh, like I said, yes, they ignored the sensory. Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why looking at their numbers, and I agree with you, yes, they ignored the sensory. And so I think that's where, the, as you mentioned, the spice, I think that's where it's at. That's where if they were to revamp, it's gonna come right there. It's gonna come right there. And then think about it is if they go into the sensory, instantly that gives you the grounding. And so vulnerability, you know, first of all, is the visual, us being visual of each other's inner qualities, right? Us being able to welcome each other's truth, right? Without the consequence of you judging a truth. It is the welcoming of the individuality. When you got that going on, the intimacy becomes automatic. That's why vulnerability and intimacy are, diametrically related. Just sync wise, they're just connected. And so within inside the system, it really looks at that, right? It also looks vulnerability also looks at your quality to be adaptable. Okay. And we don't think about that a lot of times when we think about vulnerability. But think about it. When you share vulnerability with someone, I want you to think about it. If you have experienced that, people that you or someone or whoever, people you experience a level of vulnerability with, think about how adaptable that you feel or how adaptable that you are. Really think about that because you'll find out that even if you wasn't quote unquote a very adaptable person, you find yourself with the individuals that you're very vulnerable with, you become very adaptable to, or you take on the adaptableness in situations or with the other, and so forth. Some people call it compromising. I don't like to use that word inside relationships, compromising, because compromising is associated with losing yourself. And so when we talk about vulnerability is not about losing yourself. It's always about finding yourself, maintaining yourself, but being able to see beyond yourself. Can I see your interest without trying to interject my interest in terms of how you see it? All this revolves around the vulnerability factor, you know. And of course, we know that affects the relationship dynamics and that affects the resilience, the endurance inside a relationship, and the connectivity. Because sometimes I think, especially nowadays, I think we self-convince ourselves that we can have these deep, lasting, sustainable bonds without the vulnerability piece. No. You might still be together, but you're not vulnerable. You'll find out the people you're vulnerable with that you got long time connections with. Yeah, so they will need to balance the sensory, which got them in overriding the relating. Yes, no extremes in the spice, but comfort and vulnerability promoting. Yep, perfectly said. Yep. So I think they need to do some radical, right? Like where radical vulnerability is is what they need. Even after they finish with a divorce or whatever, just between them, I think they owe it to each other because I think their picture got so switched that just for the sake of inner clarity and inner uh, resolution, I think they all need to offer each other that chance to just be vulnerable with each other. Because I don't think they really truly really see each other in enough cycles with each other to really have a true picture of what their heart is for each other or what it was. So but they had the spice. So it's easy to get caught up in the spice and think that is everything is right there where it is. But that vulnerability piece is like anything. Some of us gets and understands the vulnerability piece. Some of us have to really learn it. And some of us, it's a touchy topic, right? Because you can't be vulnerable with everybody. But when you don't put time in with someone or whatever, vulnerability is got to come in there some kind of way. And so if you've been with someone a long period of time, you seem like they don't exercise the empathy to your vulnerability. That's a flag. That's a flag that relationship is, if it's not sinking, it's experiencing like what they experience, a quiet fading, a drifting. It's not going to be loud. If there's no empathy to the vulnerabilities, this is going to be quiet drifting, quiet fading. And that's why it's hard to really detect inside relationships unless you have an outside eye that's able to help you pinpoint it and help y'all. I can remember back in the day, growing up, a lot of times the elders that were advocate of relationships, sometimes, they'll pull you to the side, especially like, the older men, and they'll pull the young men to the side and try to help them see the parts of emotional mindfulness, because a lot of times, as men, naturally we're not thinking about emotional mindfulness. And typically more mature men, because they have seasoned and maybe have been in relationships a long period of time, so they develop that quality. So a lot of times they have an eye for it. So a lot of times they're trying to tell the younger, hey, nowadays it's different. I'm talking about, stuff maybe before the 90s. You would see these things. You would get these sit downs with the elders, the elder men, your grandfathers or your uncles, and uh, men you might have placed in high regard, high esteem. You kind of you saw this. You had these were silent conversations. 'Cause a lot of times among young men, it was always about like how to make it work. How what I need to do to try to make it work. And so a lot of times, those are a lot of those conversations that would come, especially if you was a young man trying to do the right thing, by your you know by the woman or whoever was of your interest, and just trying to make sure you make it, trying to get it right. And those will come across all the time. And so, um, so in this case, you can, I'm quite sure if you look at things, there's a lot of overriding that. There ain't got to be in hostage to it either. So that's what I'm saying. I'm not going to let us go extreme and get in hostage that has to be there. You just got to have a balance. But in their case, they need radical vulnerability. They need that radical vulnerability to match that spice that they have and that freedom that they got. They got to offset it some kind of way. Excuse me. You got to offset it because if not, the other extreme is going to just take it wherever it's going to go. So let me see what else y'all got here. Excuse me. I just breathe something in. Okay, so I appreciate y'all. Share this, share some love. Hopefully, we got something. I will touch back down with another Soul to Soul Conversations, and I'll probably choose another so celebrity. After this is posted, you go in the comment section and maybe just put down who you might want me to look at. Um, I know Janae Aiko and her recent split up with Sean, and so they got some different things that we're going to try to explore. But this is pretty much in reference to Kandi and Todd. Energetically looking at this is high likelihood of what kind of occurred uh, energetically behind their relationship drifting and them kind of moving into a status of divorce. All right, so that's what's up, and appreciate everybody on here. And again, we'll touch back down again. All right, one love.